fire in the great hall had already burned for 3 hours when the drums stopped and the entire crowd went silent at once. Alara Finch stood near the back wall with her hands pressed together, trying to make herself small. She was not supposed to matter tonight. She was a healer, not a noble, and healers did not stand near the front during a selection ceremony. She had only come because every member of the pack was required to attend, and because she wanted to see the woman everyone said would become their next Luna. Alpha King Damien Voss stood on the raised stone platform at the center of the hall, dressed in black and silver, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the crowd like a man counting seconds until something ended. Beside him stood the pack elders, their faces solemn, their hands folded. Behind him burned the great fire that had not gone out in 300 years, the fire that was said to answer only to truth. Everyone knew what this night meant. Once a year, at the height of summer, the fire chose to reveal a mate's name to the alpha standing before it. Tonight, that alpha was Damien, and the entire pack believed they already knew the name he would speak. Elena Frost stood in the front row, dressed in deep red, her chin lifted, her smile already prepared for the moment her name would be called. Damien closed his eyes. The elders began the old chant, low and steady, and the fire behind him rose taller, throwing orange light across the stone floor. The crowd held its breath. Alara held hers too, though she did not know why her heart was pounding as hard as it was. Damien opened his mouth. Elena Fro. The name broke apart in his throat. His eyes snapped open, wide with confusion, and something in his chest twisted so sharply that he stumbled half a step forward. The fire surged violently, throwing sparks into the air, and when he spoke again, the sound that left his mouth was not the name he intended at all. Alara Finch. For one full second, nobody moved. Then a ripple of confusion spread through the hall like cold water poured over warm skin. Heads turned, whispers rose. Elena's smile collapsed into something between shock and fury. And Alara, who had heard her own name shouted across a room of hundreds of strangers, felt the blood drain completely from her face. "That's not," Elena started, but her voice was drowned by the sudden cry that came from Alara's wrist. A mark bloomed there, burning gold, curling into a pattern none of them had ever seen before except in old drawings kept by the elders. Alara gasped and grabbed her arm, stumbling back against the wall as heat spread up through her skin like fire under water. Across the hall, Damien cried out too, gripping his own wrist as the same mark burned into his flesh, glowing brighter with every second that passed. The elders rushed forward, their faces pale. "The bond is forming," one of them said, his voice shaking. "It is already forming." "That's impossible," Damien said, staring at his wrist as if it belonged to someone else. "I said the wrong name. I meant to say." "It does not matter what you meant to say," the eldest elder said, cutting him off. His voice was firm, though his hands trembled. "The fire does not make mistakes. Whatever name left your mouth was the name the fire allowed." Elena pushed through the crowd, shoving past guards and pack members alike until she reached the platform. Her red dress swept across the stone floor like a warning. "This is wrong," she said, her voice cracking with anger and disbelief. "I have been promised this bond since I was a child. Everyone here knows it. You cannot let a mistake decide the future of this entire kingdom." "I did not choose this," Damien said, his voice low and hard. He looked at his wrist again, then across the hall at Alara, who stood frozen against the wall with her hand still clutching her arm. "There has to be a way to undo it." The eldest elder shook his head slowly. "Once the mark ignites in front of witnesses, it cannot be undone. Not by wish, not by will, not even by the king himself." The words landed on the hall like a stone dropped into still water. Elena's face went white, then red, then something colder than either. She turned toward Alara, with an expression that made every hair on the back of Alara's neck rise. "You planned this," Elena said, stepping closer. "Somehow, you planned this." "I didn't do anything," Alara said, her voice shaking despite her effort to steady it. "I didn't even want to be here." "Then why does the mark choose you?" Elena snapped. Alara had no answer. She looked down at the golden pattern glowing faintly on her skin, and for the first time in her life, she felt like the entire world was staring directly at her, waiting for her to explain something she did not understand herself. Damien stepped down from the platform, his boots striking the stone floor with heavy, deliberate sound. The crowd parted for him the way water parts for a blade. He walked straight toward Alara, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching her face as if trying to find some hidden trick behind it. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, meant only for her, though half the hall still listened. "Alara Finch," she said. "I work in the healing house. I have lived in this pack my whole life. I have never spoken to you before tonight." Damien studied her for a long moment. Up close, she was nothing like Elena. She wore a simple gray dress instead of silk. Her hands were rough from years of grinding herbs and setting bones. Her hair was pulled back in a plain braid, not styled with jewels. And yet the mark on her wrist glowed exactly the same as the one burning on his own skin. "This is a mistake," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I know," Ilara said. "I never wanted this. I have no interest in becoming anyone's Luna, least of all yours." Something flickered behind his eyes at that, though whether it was surprise or offense, Ilara could not tell. Before he could respond, one of the guards stepped forward and addressed the elders. "What happens now?" the guard asked. "The kingdom is watching. They will want to know who their new Luna is." The eldest elder looked between Damien and Ilara, then at Elena, who stood rigid with fury barely contained beneath her composed expression. "The bond has chosen," he said finally. "Whether we understand it or not, the fire has spoken. Ilara Finch must be brought to the palace and prepared to take her place as Luna." "No," Elena said sharply. "This cannot stand. I demand a second ceremony." "There has never been a second ceremony in the history of this pack," the elder said. "The fire speaks once. We do not question it twice." Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. She looked at Ilara with an expression so sharp it felt like a blade pressed against skin. "This is not over," she said quietly, before turning and disappearing into the crowd, her red dress vanishing like a flame snuffed out by wind. Ilara felt her knees weaken. Everything around her seemed too bright, too loud, too fast. Just an hour ago, she had been folding bandages in the healing house, worrying about nothing more complicated than whether she had enough herbs for the coming week. Now she stood in the center of the great hall, marked as the future Luna of an entire kingdom she barely understood, standing beside a king who looked at her like she was a problem he had not yet figured out how to solve. "Someone should take her to the healing house," Damien said, turning to the guards. "She looks like she might fall." "I'm fine," Ilara said quickly, straightening despite the tremble in her legs. She was not going to let an entire hall of strangers watch her collapse. "I don't need help." Damien's eyes narrowed slightly, as if reevaluating something. "Very well," he said. "Then you will come to the palace tonight. There are things that must be explained to you before morning." "And if I refuse?" Ilara asked, surprising even herself with the boldness in her own voice. For a moment, the hall went quiet again, waiting to see how the Alpha King would respond to being questioned in front of his entire pack. Damien's jaw tightened, but something in his expression shifted, softening just slightly at the edges. "You cannot refuse the bond," he said, "but you can refuse to be afraid of it." Ilara did not know what to say to that. She looked down at the mark still glowing faintly gold on her wrist, then up at the man whose future had just collided violently with her own. Whatever this was, whatever the fire had decided, there was no undoing it now. The only question left was what she was going to do next. The elders began ushering the crowd out of the hall, though whispers followed Ilara like a second shadow all the way to the palace gates. Guards flanked her on either side, their expressions carefully neutral, though she caught more than one of them glancing at her wrist with open curiosity. Behind her, she could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the night air, pack members already trading theories about what the mistake meant, whether it was a sign of disaster or destiny, whether the healer girl from the back row was truly meant to rule beside their king. Ilara said nothing. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to let her fear show on her face even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Somewhere behind her, in the shifting crowd, Elena Frost watched her walk toward the palace, with an expression carved from pure ice, already turning over plans in her mind that no one else in the hall could see. By the time Ilara reached the palace steps, the fire in the great hall had finally begun to die down, its flames settling into embers as if satisfied with the chaos it had caused. She glanced back once at the glowing coals through the open doors, then turned to face the palace looming above her, its dark towers stretching up into a sky full of cold stars. Whatever waited for her inside those walls, she understood one thing with total certainty. Her old life, the quiet one she had built for herself among bandages and healing herbs, was already gone, and there was no fire in any hall that could bring it back. Inside the entrance hall, the air felt colder than the summer night outside. Tall windows lined the stone corridor, each one framed with dark curtains that barely moved, despite the breeze slipping through cracked panes. A woman in a gray uniform stepped forward to greet them, her expression polite but distant, the kind of politeness that hides judgment underneath it like a blade under silk. "I am Margaret," the woman said, giving Ilara a brief, appraising look. "I oversee the household staff. You will be shown to a chamber for tonight. Tomorrow, The elders will begin your instruction." "Instruction for what?" Alara asked. Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line. "For becoming Luna, of course. There are customs, traditions, things you will need to learn quickly, given the circumstances." The way she said circumstances made it clear exactly what she thought of those circumstances. Alara said nothing, following the woman down a long corridor lined with portraits of past alphas and their mates, their painted eyes seeming to track her as she passed. She recognized none of the names beneath the frames, though she noted how each portrait grew more elaborate, more jeweled, the closer they came to the current wing of the palace. Damien did not follow them inside. Instead, he remained near the entrance, speaking in low, clipped tones with two of the elders who had followed him from the hall. Alara caught only fragments of the conversation as Margaret led her farther away. "Cannot simply reverse a bond that has already ignited. Elena will not accept this quietly. We must prepare for what comes next." She wanted to stop and listen longer, but Margaret's pace did not allow for hesitation. They climbed a wide staircase, passed through a set of heavy wooden doors, and entered a chamber far larger than anything Alara had ever slept in. A canopy bed sat against the far wall, dressed in deep blue fabric. A wash basin rested near a tall mirror, and a fireplace crackled quietly in the corner, though no one had been in the room to light it. "This will be your chamber until further arrangements are made," Margaret said. "There are garments in the wardrobe more suitable than what you are currently wearing. I suggest you rest. Tomorrow will not be easy." "Wait," Alara said, before Margaret could leave. "What exactly happened tonight? I mean truly happened. Why did the king say my name instead of hers?" Margaret's expression flickered, just slightly, something almost like sympathy passing behind her eyes before it vanished again. "That is not for me to explain," she said. "Ask the elders in the morning, ask the king, if he will speak plainly with you, which I doubt he will tonight." She paused at the door. "For what it is worth, healer, the fire has never made an error in 300 years. Whatever tonight means, it did not happen by chance." Then she was gone, leaving Alara alone in a chamber far too grand for a girl who had spent her entire life sleeping in a small room above the healing house, surrounded by jars of dried herbs and the quiet breathing of patients recovering in the next room. Alara sat on the edge of the enormous bed and stared down at the mark still glowing faintly on her wrist. It had not faded since the ceremony, though the light had dimmed to something softer, like embers settling after a fire. She traced the pattern with her fingertip, half expecting it to disappear the moment she touched it, proof that the whole night had been some strange dream brought on by too much heat and too little food. It did not disappear. Somewhere below her window, she could hear voices carrying up from the courtyard, pack members still lingering near the palace gates despite the late hour, unable to tear themselves away from the strangest selection ceremony their generation had ever witnessed. She caught Elena's name mentioned more than once, along with words like unfair and mistake and dangerous. Alara rose from the bed and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to look down at the courtyard below. Torches lined the stone path, their flames flickering against the dark. Near the gate, she spotted a cluster of nobles speaking in hushed, urgent tones, their heads bent close together in a way that made her stomach tighten with unease. She could not hear their words from this distance, but she recognized one voice rising sharper than the others, cutting through the night air like a blade drawn from its sheath. Elena Frost stood among them, her red dress catching torchlight as she gestured sharply with one hand, clearly arguing a point the others seemed reluctant to agree with. Whatever she was proposing, the men around her did not look convinced, though none of them looked willing to refuse her outright either. Alara let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth still lingering in the summer air. Whatever Elena was planning down there in the dark, she doubted it would be anything good for the healer girl the fire had chosen instead of her. She changed out of her simple gray dress into a plain nightgown from the wardrobe, then lay down on the enormous bed, staring up at the canopy above her. Sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the fire surging behind Damien as he spoke her name, felt the searing heat of the mark burning into her wrist, heard Elena's voice cutting through the hall like a blade. By the time exhaustion finally pulled her under, the candles in her chamber had burned down to stubs, and the first hint of gray dawn was beginning to creep along the horizon outside her window. Tomorrow, the elders would come. Tomorrow, she would have to face whatever it truly meant to be chosen by a fire that never made mistakes, standing beside a king who had never wanted her at all. A fist pounded on Alara's chamber door before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and she sat upright in bed with her heart already racing before she was even fully awake. "Enter," she called, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as if it could shield her from whatever the day was about to bring. Margaret stepped inside, followed by two younger servants carrying folded garments and a tray of untouched food. Her expression was as unreadable as it had been the night before, though her eyes moved quickly over Alara's tired face, taking note of the dark circles beneath her eyes. "The elders wish to speak with you within the hour," Margaret said. "You will need to dress properly. These will not do." She gestured toward the plain nightgown Alara still wore, then nodded at the folded garments in the servant's arms, deep green fabric embroidered with silver thread along the collar. "I don't need fine clothes to speak with the elders," Alara said, though she already suspected arguing would accomplish nothing. "It is not for your comfort," Margaret said. "It is for how the pack will see you. Like it or not, healer, you are Luna now. People will judge every thread on your body before they judge a single word from your mouth." Alara said nothing more, allowing the servants to help her dress in silence. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, heavier and stiffer than anything she had worn before, and she found herself missing the simple gray dresses that had never made her feel like she was wearing someone else's skin. By the time she was led into the council chamber, the elders were already seated around a long stone table, their expressions grave. Damien stood near the window with his back to the room, his arms crossed, staring out at the courtyard where guards drilled in tight formation below. "Sit," the eldest elder said, gesturing to an empty chair across from him. Alara obeyed, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Last night," the elder began, "the fire chose you as Luna to Alpha King Damien Voss. This has never happened by accident in the history of our pack, though we understand this comes as a shock to you as much as to anyone else in that hall." "How can it not be an accident?" Alara asked. He meant to say another name. Everyone heard him try. "The mouth may intend one thing," the elder said, "but the fire listens to something deeper than intention. It listens to truth. The speaker may not yet know himself. We do not fully understand the mechanism, but we know its history. It has never once been wrong." Damien turned from the window at that, his expression tight. "With respect," he said, "I would like to understand exactly what this means for the kingdom before we speak of destiny and truth. Alara is untrained in matters of rule. She knows nothing of court politics, treaties, or diplomacy." "Then she will learn," the elder said simply, "as every Luna before her has learned. Elena Frost was raised for this role since childhood, yes, but preparation does not create a bond. Only the fire creates a bond, and it has chosen otherwise." Alara felt heat rise to her face at being discussed, as though she were not sitting directly across the table. "I can hear you," she said, sharper than she intended. "And for what it is worth, I have no interest in taking anything from anyone. I did not ask for this." The room fell quiet for a moment. Damien studied her carefully, something shifting behind his gaze, though whether it was respect or simple surprise at her boldness, she could not tell. "No one is accusing you of ambition," the elder said gently, "but like it or not, the pack now looks to you as their future Luna. Elena Frost has powerful allies among the noble houses. Some will resist your place here. It would serve you well to understand the danger in that before it grows worse." "What kind of danger?" Alara asked. The elders exchanged a brief look before the eldest spoke again. "Elena's family has held influence in this court for 3 generations. Her father sits on the Trade Council. Her mother oversees the Northern Territories. If they choose to make trouble for you, they have the resources to do so quietly and effectively, in ways that will not always be easy to see coming." Alara's stomach tightened. She thought of the cluster of nobles she had seen from her window the night before, Elena's sharp voice cutting through the dark, the way the men around her had looked reluctant yet unwilling to refuse her outright. "Then what am I supposed to do?" she asked. "I don't know anything about court politics. I know how to set broken bones and brew fever medicine." "You will learn," Damien said, his voice quieter now, though still edged with something guarded. "I will see to it personally that you receive proper instruction. Whatever this bond means, I will not let you walk into danger unprepared." It was the first thing he had said directly to her that morning, and Alara found herself studying his face, trying to read whether the words came from genuine concern or simple duty. His jaw was still tight, his shoulders still rigid, and she suspected the truth was closer to obligation than warmth. Still, it was something. The meeting continued for another hour, the elders explaining customs, ceremonies, and expectations Alara barely absorbed through her growing exhaustion. By the time she was finally released, her head ached and her chest felt tight with the weight of everything suddenly resting on her shoulders. She wandered the palace gardens afterward, needing air and space away from stone walls and watching eyes. The gardens were quiet at this hour, most of the staff occupied elsewhere, and she found a bench beneath a wide, flowering tree where she could finally breathe without an audience. She had not been sitting long when footsteps approached along the gravel path. She looked up, expecting a servant, but found Elena Frost standing before her instead, dressed simply today in pale blue rather than her ceremonial red, though her expression carried no less fire than it had the night before. "I wondered when we would speak properly," Elena said, seating herself uninvited on the opposite end of the bench. Alara straightened, caution rising instantly. "I don't want any trouble between us," she said. "I never asked for any of this." "That is what everyone keeps saying," Elena replied, her voice deceptively calm. "Yet here you sit, in the palace gardens, wearing silk you did not own yesterday, while I go home to an empty house my family built, expecting a very different outcome." "I'm sorry for your disappointment," Alara said carefully, "but the fire chose. I did not force anything." "Perhaps not," Elena said, tilting her head slightly. "But fire can be misread, traditions can be reinterpreted, and mistakes, healer, can sometimes be corrected, given enough patience and the right circumstances." Alara felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "What are you suggesting?" Elena smiled, though the expression never reached her eyes. "Nothing at all. Only that you should be careful how comfortable you allow yourself to become here. Palaces have a way of testing those who do not belong in them." She rose from the bench, smoothing her skirt with practiced grace. "Enjoy the gardens while you can, Alara. I have a feeling your time among them may be shorter than the elders would like you to believe." She walked away without waiting for a response, her steps unhurried, confident, the walk of someone who had already begun setting plans into motion long before this conversation had started. Alara remained on the bench long after Elena disappeared around a hedge, her heart pounding with a fear she had not expected to feel from a simple conversation in a sunny garden. That evening, as the palace settled into quiet, Alara found herself walking the corridors unable to sleep, her mind replaying every warning she had received since the night before. She passed Damien's study by chance, the door slightly ajar, lamplight spilling into the hallway. She should have kept walking. Instead, she paused, drawn by the sound of his voice speaking low and urgent to someone she could not see. "She cannot simply be discarded," Damien was saying. "Even if I wish to challenge the bond, the elders have made clear, there is no path to undo it without inviting disaster upon the entire pack." "Then you accept her," came a second voice, one of the elders she recognized from the morning meeting. "I accept the bond," Damien said, his tone heavy. "Whether I accept the woman remains to be seen." The word struck harder than Alara expected, a quiet ache blooming in her chest that she quickly pushed down, refusing to let herself feel wounded by a truth she already knew. She was a stranger to him, a mistake wearing borrowed silk. Whatever the fire had decided, the man behind that door had not chosen her, and pretending otherwise would only lead to disappointment she could not afford. She turned and walked back toward her chamber, her steps quiet against the stone floor, her mind already turning over Elena's warning from the garden and Damien's honest words from behind his study door. Whatever safety she thought she had found within these palace walls, she understood now with painful clarity that it was an illusion built on obligation rather than welcome. If she was going to survive here, among nobles who resented her and a king who tolerated her at best, she would need to rely on herself, just as she always had. The healing house had taught her patience, resilience, and the ability to remain calm when everything around her fell into chaos. She would need every ounce of that training in the days ahead, because whatever Elena Frost was planning behind her calm smile and pale blue dress, Alara suspected it was only the beginning. A scream echoed from the kitchen wing before dawn had even broken, and Alara was out of bed and running before she had time to think. She reached the narrow servant stairwell just as two maids came rushing up from below, their faces pale, one of them pressing a cloth to a bleeding cut on her palm. Behind them, smoke curled thin and gray from the kitchen doorway, and the smell of scorched fabric hung heavy in the air. "What happened?" Alara asked, catching the injured maid by the shoulder to steady her. "The oven," the maid said, her voice shaking. "It caught fire. Nobody knows how. It has never done that before." Alara guided her toward a bench near the stairwell window and examined the cut quickly, pressing the cloth firmer against the wound to slow the bleeding. "This needs cleaning and wrapping properly," she said. "Come with me to the healing supplies. I keep a small store of herbs in my chamber." The maid nodded gratefully, though her eyes kept darting nervously toward the kitchen doorway, as if afraid the fire might follow them up the stairs. As Alara led her away, she caught sight of two guards inspecting the scorched oven, their expressions troubled rather than simply concerned about an accident. One of them knelt near the base of the oven, running his fingers along a blackened seam, then looked up sharply at the other guard and shook his head, as though confirming something they had both suspected. Alara did not have time to ask questions. She spent the next hour cleaning and dressing the maid's wound, her hands moving through familiar motions that felt like the only steady thing in a palace otherwise unfamiliar to her. When she finally finished, the maid thanked her quietly, clearly surprised that the new Luna had tended to her personally rather than summoning someone else to do it. "You did not need to help me yourself," the maid said. "I wanted to," Ilara replied simply. "This is what I know how to do." Word of the small kindness spread through the palace faster than Ilara expected. By midday, she noticed the servants who passed her in the hallways no longer averted their eyes quite so quickly. Though the noble guests still regarded her with the same cold suspicion as before, she overheard two of them speaking near the library entrance, their voices pitched just loud enough to carry. "A healer playing at Luna," one of them muttered. "It would be laughable if it were not so dangerous for the kingdom's reputation." "Elena Frost would never have soiled her hands treating a servant's wound," the other replied. Ilara kept walking, refusing to let the words slow her steps. Though they settled into her chest like small stones she could not shake loose. She understood now that every kindness she offered would be measured against expectations built for someone else entirely, someone raised in silk and jewels rather than bandages and dried herbs. That afternoon, Damien summoned her to the training yard, where guards drilled in tight formation beneath the midday sun. He stood at the edge of the yard, watching the exercises with the same rigid posture he seemed to carry everywhere, arms crossed, jaw set. "You should learn the basics of self-protection," he said without preamble as she approached. "Given the circumstances of your new position, it would serve you well to understand how to defend yourself, if the need ever arose." "I know how to use a blade for cutting bandages and herbs," Ilara said. "Nothing more elaborate than that. Then we begin with something simple." He gestured to a wooden practice sword resting against a nearby post. "Pick it up." Ilara hesitated only a moment before obeying, gripping the unfamiliar weight awkwardly in her hand. Damien demonstrated a basic stance, correcting her posture with brief, impersonal instructions, though she noticed the careful distance he kept, as though touching her even briefly to adjust her grip required more consideration than it should have. "You are overthinking every movement," he said after her third failed attempt to mirror his stance correctly. "Trust your body. It knows more than your mind does when it comes to defense." "Easy for you to say," Ilara replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "You have trained for this your entire life. I have spent mine grinding herbs and setting bones." Something almost like amusement flickered across his face, quickly suppressed. "Then we will simply have to make up for lost time," he said, adjusting her stance again, his hands lingering just slightly longer than necessary before he stepped back. They continued for another hour, Ilara growing steadily less clumsy with each exchange, though she remained far from skilled. Near the end of the session, as she caught her breath leaning against a wooden post, she noticed Damien watching her with an expression she could not immediately place, something between curiosity and reluctant respect. "You do not quit easily," he observed. "Most in your position would have given up after the first failed attempt." "I have never had the luxury of quitting easily," Ilara said. "When you grow up without much, you learn to keep trying no matter how many times something falls apart around you." Damien's expression shifted slightly at that, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Tell me about your childhood," he said, surprising her with the sudden directness of the request. Ilara studied him for a moment, uncertain whether the interest was genuine or simply another form of evaluation, another test to determine whether she was worthy of the mark burning on both their wrists. Eventually, she decided honesty cost her nothing. "My parents died when I was young," she said. "A fever swept through our village. I barely remember them now."
"Just fragments."
My mother's voice singing something I can no longer recall the words to. My father's hands, rough from farm work. She paused, running her thumb along the edge of the practice sword still in her grip. "I was raised by the healing house after that. The old healer who ran it, a woman named Beatrice, took in orphans and taught us her trade in exchange for helping with the work. I owe everything I know to her patience." "And Elena grew up in comfort, expecting this bond her entire life," Damien said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I imagine that must feel strange for you," Ilara said carefully, "having your expectations shattered so publicly." Damien's jaw tightened. "It is not the shattering of expectation that troubles me most," he said. "It is not knowing whether the fire chose correctly, or whether it simply made an error neither of us can undo." The honesty of the admission stung more than Ilara expected, though she understood it was not meant cruelly. He was simply speaking the truth he carried, the same uncertainty that had followed her since the moment her name left his mouth in that burning hall. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "the fire did not choose either of us specifically. Perhaps it chose something neither of us can see yet." Damien studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his guarded expression, though he said nothing further on the matter. Instead, he gestured toward the practice sword still in her hand. Again, he said, from the beginning. They continued training until the sun began sinking toward the horizon, and by the time Alara finally returned to her chamber that evening, her arms ached and her mind felt slightly less burdened than it had that morning. Whatever this bond truly meant, whatever Elena continued to scheme in the shadows of the palace, she found herself thinking that perhaps survival here would require more than simple endurance. Perhaps, slowly, it might also require learning to see the man beside her as something more than an obligation neither of them had chosen. That night, as she prepared for sleep, a folded note slid beneath her chamber door, pushed silently by unseen hands. She retrieved it cautiously, unfolding the paper to find a single line written in elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. The fire was not the only thing that burned in that hall, healer. Watch carefully who else was tending flames that night. Alara stared at the note for a long time, her pulse quickening as she turned the words over in her mind. Someone in this palace knew something about the ceremony that had not yet been spoken aloud, something beyond a simple mistake of the tongue. She folded the note carefully and tucked it beneath her pillow, understanding with sudden clarity that the danger surrounding her was far from finished unfolding. The note was gone by morning. Alara woke before dawn, reaching beneath her pillow out of habit, only to find empty space where the folded paper had been the night before. Her breath caught. She sat up quickly, searching the bedding, the floor beside the bed, even beneath the frame itself, but the note had vanished as completely as if it had never existed at all. Someone had entered her chamber while she slept. She pressed her back against the headboard, heart pounding, eyes scanning every shadow in the room for a sign of movement. The door remained closed, the latch still fastened from the inside, and the window showed no signs of having been opened. Whoever had taken the note had done so with practiced silence, the kind of skill that came from long experience moving unseen through places they were not meant to be. She dressed quickly and made her way to Damien's study, finding him already awake, poring over documents spread across his desk. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting to concern the moment he saw her face. "Someone was in my chamber last night," she said without preamble, closing the door behind her. "A note was slipped under my door. When I woke this morning, it was gone." "What did the note say?" Damien asked, setting down his papers. "That the fire was not the only thing burning that night, that I should watch carefully who else was tending flames." She hesitated. "I don't know what it means, but someone clearly does not want me thinking too carefully about the ceremony." Damien's expression darkened. He rose from his desk and moved to the door, calling for a guard stationed in the hallway. "Double the watch outside the Luna's chamber tonight," he said. "No one enters or exits without my knowledge." "You believe someone is trying to frighten me," Alara said, "or silence something before I learn it." "I believe," Damien said slowly, "that whoever wrote that note knows something about that ceremony. Neither of us has been told." He paused, his jaw tightening with old memory. "There is history here you do not yet understand, Alara. History between myself and Elena that predates any of this." Alara sat down across from his desk, sensing he was finally about to offer something honest. "Tell me," she said. Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring at the window as morning light slowly filled the room. "Elena and I grew up together," he began. "Our fathers were close allies, and our families assumed from childhood that our bond would be a formality, a confirmation of what everyone already expected rather than a true test of the fire's judgment. I never questioned it. I never had reason to." "You cared for her," Alara said quietly. "I cared for the idea of her," Damien corrected, his voice heavy. "The comfort of certainty. Elena is intelligent, capable, raised precisely for the role she believed she would inherit. I convinced myself that affection would follow naturally from familiarity, the way it does for many arranged unions in noble families." He shook his head slowly. "I never once considered the fire might disagree with everyone's careful planning." "And now?" Alara asked. "Now I find myself bonded to a woman I know almost nothing about," Damien said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time that morning, "who has shown more courage in 3 days than most nobles show in a lifetime, and who somehow already understands more about the danger surrounding this palace than the family who raised me to inherit it." Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks at the unexpected honesty, though she pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the more pressing matter. "Who else was near the fire that night?" she asked. "Besides you, the elders, and myself. Someone must have been close enough to interfere, if that is truly what happened." Damien considered this carefully. "The elders stand nearest the flame during the ceremony. Beyond them, only the ceremonial guard is permitted within arm's reach, and they are chosen specifically for their loyalty and discretion. Then perhaps the interference did not come from someone standing near the fire, Elara said slowly, an idea forming. Perhaps it came from someone who prepared the fire beforehand, someone who had access to it long before the ceremony began. Damien's eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. The fire is prepared each year by the same keeper, he said, an old man named Edmund, who has tended that flame since before I was born. Could he be persuaded to speak with someone who wished him harm, or paid to alter something in the ritual? Elara asked. Edmund is fiercely loyal, Damien said, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face even as he spoke the words. But loyalty can be tested by the right pressure, applied by the right hands. They found Edmund an hour later, in the small stone chamber beneath the great hall, where the ceremonial supplies were kept between festivals. He was an old man with kind eyes and trembling hands, and the moment Damien asked him directly about the night of the ceremony, his composure crumbled entirely. I did nothing to harm the ritual, Edmund said quickly, his voice shaking. I swear it on my own life, my king. I only added the herbs I was instructed to add, exactly as I have every year since I took this position. Instructed by whom? Damien asked, his voice low and dangerous. Edmund's eyes darted nervously toward the door before returning to Damien's face. A noblewoman came to me 3 days before the ceremony, he admitted. She said the additional herbs were traditional, meant to strengthen the fire's clarity. I saw no reason to question her, given her family's long history with the ceremonial rites. Which noblewoman? Elara asked, though she already suspected the answer before Edmund spoke it. Lady Frost, Edmund whispered, Elena Frost's mother. The revelation settled over the small stone chamber like a shadow crossing the sun. Damien's expression turned to something cold and controlled, the fury beneath it barely contained. Elara felt a chill spread through her chest, understanding now that whatever had happened in that hall was not simple mistake or divine accident at all. What herbs did she give you? Damien asked, his voice deceptively calm. Edmund hesitated, clearly torn between fear of the consequences and fear of continued silence. A rare flower, he said finally, called clear flame root. It is said to strip away deception from the fire, forcing it to reveal only absolute truth, without any influence from expectation or desire. Elara's breath caught. Then the fire did not make a mistake at all, she said slowly. It was given something that forced it to ignore every expectation surrounding the ceremony, every assumption everyone carried into that hall, and speak only the truest bond it could find. Lady Frost believed she was strengthening her daughter's claim, Damien said grimly. Instead, she stripped away the very influence that might have secured it. She tried to guarantee an outcome, Elara said, and instead, exposed the truth she was trying to control. Damien turned to Edmund, his expression hardening further. You will speak nothing of this conversation to anyone until I decide how best to proceed, he said. Do you understand? Edmund nodded quickly, relief and fear mixing plainly across his weathered face. Yes, my king. Not a word. They left the chamber in silence, climbing back toward the main halls of the palace, both lost in thought over what they had just discovered. Whatever the note left in Elara's chamber had intended to reveal, it had led them somewhere far more dangerous than either of them expected, straight to the doorstep of Elena's own family. If Lady Frost tampered with the ceremony, Elara said finally, breaking the silence between them, and Elena learns we know the truth, what will she do? Damien's expression turned grave. Whatever she believes necessary to protect her family's reputation, he said, and that, Elara, may prove far more dangerous than anything either of us has faced so far. Word reached the palace by mid-morning that sickness had broken out in the Omega Quarter, and within an hour, 3 more households reported the same violent fever spreading through their children. Elara heard the news while sitting with Damien in his study, still processing the truth about Lady Frost and the tampered ceremony fire. A young guard burst through the door without waiting for permission, his face pale with alarm. My king, he said, breathless. The Omega Quarter. People are collapsing in the streets. The healers there say they have never seen anything like it. Elara was on her feet before Damien could respond. How many are affected? She asked. At least 20 by last count, the guard said, more by the hour. Take me there, Elara said immediately. Absolutely not, Damien said, rising from his chair. The palace physician can be sent instead. It is not safe for the Luna to walk into an unknown illness without proper precaution. I am a trained healer, Elara said, turning to face him directly. I have handled fever outbreaks before. Every moment we spend arguing is a moment those children spend suffering without proper care. Alara, I did not ask to become Luna, she said, cutting him off firmly. But if this bond means anything at all, it should mean I am allowed to use the one skill I actually possess to help the people who need it most. Damien studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between duty and concern, before finally exhaling sharply. Then I am coming with you, he said. I will not have you walking into danger alone. They rode together toward the Omega Quarter, a poorer section of the kingdom tucked along the eastern edge of the city walls, where modest homes crowded close together along narrow streets. The moment they arrived, Alara understood the guard had not exaggerated the severity of the situation. Families huddled outside their homes, faces pale and frightened, while inside, coughing and cries of pain carried through open windows. The local healer, an exhausted woman named Clara, met them at the entrance to a small clinic overwhelmed with patients. I have never seen fever spread this quickly, Clara said, wiping sweat from her brow. It moves from healthy to severe within hours. I fear we may lose several of the youngest before nightfall if we cannot find something to slow it. Show me your most severe cases, Alara said, already rolling up her sleeves. Clara led her inside to where a young boy, no older than 7, lay trembling beneath a thin blanket, his skin flushed with heat, his breathing shallow and rapid. Alara knelt beside him immediately, pressing the back of her hand against his forehead, checking his pulse, examining his eyes for signs she recognized from years working in the healing house. This is not simple fever, she said after a moment. Look at the rash along his arms, and the way his breathing catches at the end of each cycle. She turned to Clara. Have you tried silverleaf tea mixed with crushed bitter root? Clara shook her head. We ran out of silverleaf 3 days ago. The supply chains from the northern territories have been delayed. Alara's mind raced through years of training, searching for alternatives. What about river willow bark? It carries similar properties, though weaker. Combined with proper dosing and frequent application, it may slow the progression enough to buy time. We have river willow, Clara said, hope flickering across her exhausted face. I did not think to combine it that way. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, moving from patient to patient, Alara adjusting treatments based on each child's specific symptoms, while Clara and the other local healers followed her guidance with growing confidence. Damien remained close throughout, helping carry supplies, comforting frightened parents, and organizing the chaotic clinic into something resembling order. By nightfall, the worst of the fevers had begun to break. The young boy Alara had first examined slept peacefully, his breathing steady, his skin cooling beneath the careful treatment she had administered. Parents who had arrived frantic hours earlier now wept with quiet relief, thanking Alara with a gratitude that felt more genuine than any ceremonial title the court had bestowed upon her. You saved them, Clara said, watching Alara finally sit down for the first time in hours, exhaustion evident in every line of her posture. I have practiced healing for 20 years, and I have never seen anyone combine treatments the way you did today. I learned from a woman named Beatrice, Alara said quietly. She always said the best healers pay attention to what the body is truly telling them, rather than simply following what the books recommend. Damien approached, offering her a cup of water, which she accepted gratefully. You should be proud of what you accomplished here today, he said. I am simply relieved they will recover, Alara replied, though something in his tone made her look up at him more carefully. His expression had shifted since they arrived, the guarded distance she had grown accustomed to, replaced with something warmer, something closer to genuine admiration. I underestimated you, he admitted quietly. I assumed the fire had made an error. That circumstance alone had placed you in a role you were unprepared for. Watching you today, I am no longer certain that assumption was correct. Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure how to respond to the sudden vulnerability in his voice. Before she could answer, a commotion arose near the clinic entrance, and both of them turned to see a rider dismounting hastily, urgency written across his face. My king, the rider said, breathless from hard riding. News from the northern border. Scouts report unusual movement from the Ashbourne Kingdom. It may be nothing, but the captain thought you should know immediately. Damien's expression sharpened instantly, the warmth from moments before replaced by focused concern. How large a force? He asked. Difficult to say for certain, the rider admitted, but large enough that the captain felt it warranted your attention without delay. Alara watched the shift in Damien's demeanor, understanding immediately that whatever fragile peace had settled over the day was about to be tested by something far larger than fever or family scheming. She rose from her seat, her exhaustion pushed aside by a new, colder awareness settling into her chest. What does this mean? She asked. It means, Damien said grimly, that we may not have the luxury of resolving matters within our own walls before facing threats from beyond them as well. The ride back to the palace passed largely in silence, both of them lost in separate thoughts, the warmth of the clinic replaced by the weight of uncertain danger stretching ahead. Elara glanced at Damien's profile in the moonlight, noting the tension etched into every line of his face, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether the fire that had bound them together had known something about the days ahead that neither of them could yet see clearly. A crash of shattering glass echoed through the palace corridor just as Elara stepped out of the council chamber, and she spun toward the sound in time to see a serving tray scattered across the floor, a young maid backing away from a furious noblewoman with her hands raised in apology. "Clumsy girl," the noblewoman snapped, though her eyes flicked toward Elara the moment she noticed her presence, calculation replacing irritation almost instantly. "Forgive the disturbance, Luna. Accidents happen so easily these days, don't they?" Elara recognized her as one of Elena's closest companions, a woman named Rosalind who had made her disdain for the new Luna clear from the very first day. She said nothing, simply nodding once before continuing down the corridor, though she felt Rosalind's gaze following her the entire way. The days since the discovery about Lady Frost's tampering with the ceremony fire had passed in tense quiet, Damien choosing to withhold the accusation until they understood the full scope of what had happened and what Elena's family intended to do next. But quiet, Elara was learning, rarely meant safety within these walls. It simply meant danger moving more carefully, waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, as she made her way toward the dining hall for a formal gathering of noble families, she found the corridor unusually crowded, clusters of nobles speaking in hushed, urgent tones that quieted the moment she passed. She caught fragments regardless, words like scandal and unnatural and dark magic drifting through the air like poison carried on wind. She found Damien near the entrance to the hall, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. "What is happening?" she asked quietly. "A rumor has begun circulating among the noble houses," he said, guiding her aside from the main crowd, "that you used forbidden means to force the fire's hand during the ceremony. That the mark on your wrist is not a true bond, but something manufactured through dark practice." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. "That's absurd," she said. "I did nothing. I did not even want this bond." "I know that," Damien said firmly, "but belief does not always follow truth, especially when someone works hard to spread a different story." "Elena," Elara said, understanding immediately. "I cannot prove it yet," Damien said, "but the timing is far too convenient to be coincidence. If this rumor takes hold among enough noble families, it could weaken your position beyond repair, regardless of what actually happened that night." The formal gathering that followed felt like walking through a room full of blades disguised as polite conversation. Nobles who had merely ignored Elara before now watched her with open suspicion, whispering behind gloved hands the moment she passed. She held her composure through sheer will, remembering every lesson the elders had drilled into her about grace under scrutiny, though her hands trembled slightly beneath the long sleeves of her gown. Elena arrived fashionably late, dressed once again in striking red, her expression carefully arranged into something approaching sympathy as she approached Elara near the center of the hall. "I have heard the terrible rumors circulating about you," Elena said, her voice pitched just loud enough for nearby nobles to overhear. "How dreadful, to be accused of such things, especially when you claim complete innocence in how this bond came to be." "I am innocent," Elara said evenly, refusing to let Elena's calculated performance rattle her outwardly. "And I suspect you already know exactly how this bond came to be, given your mother's involvement in preparing the ceremonial fire." The hall did not go silent, the conversation around them continuing obliviously, but Elena's expression flickered, just for an instant, genuine alarm breaking through her careful composure before she smoothed it away again. "I do not know what you mean," Elena said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Then perhaps we should discuss it somewhere more private," Elara said quietly. "Before I decide, it might be better discussed in front of the entire noble council instead." Elena's jaw tightened, calculation returning swiftly behind her eyes. "Careful, healer," she murmured, low enough that only Elara could hear. "Accusations without proof can damage the accuser just as easily as the accused." "I have proof," Elara said simply. "A ceremonial keeper willing to speak the truth, and herbs traced directly to your family's private garden." For the first time since the ceremony, Elara watched genuine fear cross Elena's expression before the noblewoman composed herself and turned away, disappearing quickly into the crowd without another word. Damien, who had witnessed the exchange from a short distance, approached with visible concern. "What did you say to her?" he asked. I let her know we are aware of her mother's involvement, Alara said. I suspect the rumors about dark magic will find a way to quiet themselves rather quickly now. Damien studied her with something like admiration. You continue to surprise me, he said. I have spent my whole life being underestimated, Alara replied. It turns out that has its advantages. Despite the small victory, the tension in the hall did not fully dissolve, and Alara noticed several nobles continuing to watch her throughout the remainder of the evening, with expressions ranging from curiosity to lingering suspicion. Rumors, she understood, rarely vanished as quickly as they appeared, even once their source had been exposed. Later that night, as the gathering finally began to thin, one of the elders approached Damien and Alara with an urgent expression, drawing them both aside into a quiet alcove away from prying ears. My king, the elder said, I have spoken with Edmund again this evening. He mentioned something he had not thought significant before, but given recent events, I believe you should hear it directly. Go on, Damien said. Edmund recalled that Lady Frost specifically requested the clear flame root be added only to the portion of fire nearest where you would be standing during the ceremony, the elder explained. She believed it would ensure the fire recognized Elena's name with absolute clarity, stripping away any doubt from your own heart about the match everyone expected. But instead, Alara said slowly, working through the implication, it stripped away every expectation entirely, revealing only the truest bond, regardless of what anyone hoped to hear. Precisely, the elder said, which means the fire's choice of you, Luna, was not weakened by the tampering. If anything, it was the only outcome the fire could produce once every artificial influence had been removed. The words settled over Alara with unexpected weight, something shifting quietly inside her chest. If the elder was correct, then the mark on her wrist was not an accident born from confusion or error at all. It was the clearest truth the ceremony had ever produced, uncomplicated by expectation, family pressure, or childhood promises made long before either of them had any say in the matter. She glanced at Damien, finding him watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something steady and searching all at once, as though he too was only now beginning to understand the true weight of what the fire had chosen between them. Then Elena's mother did not create a mistake that night, Damien said quietly. She created certainty. Neither of them spoke further on the matter that evening, though something between them had shifted, quiet and unspoken, carried forward into the uncertain days that still lay ahead. A stack of ancient scrolls toppled from a high shelf the moment Alara pulled the wrong volume free, and she barely stepped back in time to avoid being buried beneath centuries of brittle parchment. Careful, came a dry voice from behind a nearby desk. Those records survived 300 years. I would prefer they not meet their end beneath your boots. Alara turned to find an elderly man watching her with sharp, curious eyes, seated among towering shelves of records in the palace archive, a private wing of the library she had only recently learned existed. His name was Nathaniel, the pack historian, a man Damien had suggested she visit after their conversation about the fire's true nature. I apologize, Alara said, carefully restacking the fallen scrolls. I was searching for anything related to past selection ceremonies. Specifically, any record of the fire choosing a name other than the one intended. Nathaniel's eyebrows rose with interest. An unusual request, he said, though given recent events, perhaps not surprising that you would come asking. You know what happened, Alara said. Everyone in this palace knows what happened, Nathaniel replied, though few understand what it truly means. He rose slowly from his desk, gesturing for her to follow him deeper into the archive, past shelves that seemed to stretch back further than the room itself should have allowed. Sit, he said, indicating a small table surrounded by neat stacks of organized records. I have spent 40 years studying the history of this pack's ceremonies. Allow me to share what I have learned. Alara sat eagerly, grateful for the chance to finally understand something beyond rumor and speculation. Nathaniel retrieved a thick, leather-bound volume from a nearby shelf, its pages yellowed with age, and opened it carefully to a marked section. There have been 4 recorded instances in our pack's history, he began, where the name spoken during selection did not match the name the Alpha intended to speak. In every single case, without exception, the bond that resulted proved stronger and more enduring than any bond formed through expected, arranged matches. Why would that be true? Alara asked. Because the fire does not respond to intention, Nathaniel explained. It responds to something far deeper, something the conscious mind often fails to recognize in itself. Expectation, duty, family pressure, childhood familiarity. These things can convince a person they know their own heart, when in truth, they have simply accepted the answer placed in front of them since birth. He turned a page carefully, revealing detailed illustrations of ceremonial marks, similar to the one still glowing faintly on Alara's wrist. The fire strips all of that away. It looks past what a person believes they want, and reveals instead what would truly serve them best, body and soul together. Then every mistake recorded in this book was not truly a mistake at all, Alara said slowly. Never, Nathaniel confirmed. Though I understand why the pack would call them mistakes, it is far more comfortable to believe in error than to accept that everything we assumed we understood about ourselves might be incomplete. Alara sat in thoughtful silence, absorbing the weight of what Nathaniel had shared. She thought of Damien's confession about Elena, how he had convinced himself affection would follow naturally from familiarity and comfort, never once questioning whether the fire might reveal something entirely different beneath those careful assumptions. There is something else you should know, Nathaniel continued, turning to another section of the ancient volume. The tampering your king described to me, the clear flame root added to strip away outside influence, has appeared once before in our recorded history, nearly 120 years ago. Alara leaned forward with sudden interest. What happened? A noble family, much like Elena's, attempted to secure a favorable match for their daughter, using the very same method, Nathaniel said. They believed removing all doubt from the fire's judgment would guarantee the outcome everyone already expected. Instead, the fire revealed a bond between the alpha of that generation and a servant girl working in the palace stables, a woman with no noble blood and no claim to influence whatsoever. What became of them? Alara asked. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. They ruled together for 40 years, he said. Their reign is remembered even now as one of the most prosperous and peaceful in our pack's entire history. The servant girl, once dismissed by every noble family in the kingdom, became beloved by common folk and nobility alike by the time her rule ended. The story settled over Alara like a quiet promise, though she refused to let herself hope too openly, uncertain whether her own path would follow such a fortunate course. Still, something in her chest loosened slightly, a small measure of peace finding its way into the uncertainty that had followed her since the night of the ceremony. Why does no one speak of this history? She asked. If 4 recorded mistakes prove to be truer bonds than any arranged match, why does the pack continue treating this as scandal rather than opportunity? Nathaniel closed the ancient volume with careful reverence. Fear, he said simply. It is far easier to control outcomes through arrangement and expectation than to trust something as unpredictable as fire, choosing freely on its own. Noble families have built entire fortunes and alliances around guaranteed matches. The idea that fate might disregard all of that in an instant terrifies those who depend on certainty to maintain their power. Then Elena's family did not simply want to secure her position, Alara said, understanding deepening with every word. They feared exactly what has now happened, a truth the fire could reveal that no amount of planning could prevent. Precisely, Nathaniel said. And now that the truth has been revealed regardless of their efforts to prevent it, I imagine they will grow considerably more desperate to undo what they failed to control in the first place. Alara left the archive that afternoon, carrying more than simple knowledge. She carried a quiet, growing conviction that whatever battles still lay ahead, the bond she shared with Damien was not built on error or accident, but on something the fire itself had judged worthy, stripped bare of every expectation and pressure that might have clouded a truer answer. She found Damien later that evening in the training yard, working through forms alone in the fading light, his movements sharp and controlled despite the visible weight of exhaustion in his shoulders. She approached quietly, watching him for a moment, before he noticed her presence and lowered his blade. I spoke with Nathaniel today, she said, about the history of the fire's judgment. Damien's expression grew attentive. And what did you learn? That every recorded instance of a name spoken in error produced a stronger bond than any arranged match in our pack's history, Alara said. That the fire does not make mistakes, even when the people around it desperately want to believe otherwise. Something shifted in Damien's expression, a tension she had not noticed carrying loosening slightly from his posture. I have spent every day since that ceremony wondering whether I had simply failed to speak the name I was supposed to, he admitted quietly. Wondering whether some error on my part had trapped you in a bond neither of us truly wanted. And now, Alara asked, now I wonder whether I spent years mistaking familiarity for something it was never truly meant to be, Damien said, his voice quieter still. And whether the fire simply corrected a mistake I made long before I ever stood before those flames. Alara felt her heart quicken at the admission, though she said nothing immediately, allowing the weight of his words to settle between them in the quiet evening air. Whatever uncertainty had defined their bond since that chaotic night in the Great Hall, Something new had begun taking shape instead, fragile but undeniable, growing slowly stronger with every truth they uncovered together. Horns blared across the palace walls in the middle of the night, jolting Alara from sleep with a violence that left her heart slamming against her ribs before she even understood what the sound meant. She threw on her robe and ran into the corridor, finding guards rushing past in full armor, their faces set with grim urgency. She caught one by the arm as he passed. "What is happening?" "Ashborn forces have crossed the northern border," he said quickly. "They struck the outer villages an hour ago. The king has already gone to the war room." Alara released him and ran toward the war room herself, ignoring the servant who called after her that the Luna should remain in safer quarters during times of conflict. She found Damien standing over a large map spread across a stone table, surrounded by his generals, his expression carved from cold determination. "How many casualties?" he was asking as she entered. "Unknown yet," one general replied, "but the villages along the border had little warning. We must assume losses among civilians as well as our border guard. Send riders to gather the wounded and bring them here," Damien ordered. "The healing house cannot handle numbers this large alone. We will need every healer in the capital working together." "I can help organize that," Alara said, stepping fully into the room. Every head turned toward her, several generals exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unaccustomed to a Luna involving herself directly in matters of war. "Alara," Damien said, "this is not." "I have spent my entire life treating wounds and illness," she interrupted firmly. "If hundreds of your people are about to arrive injured, you need someone who can organize that response quickly and efficiently. I can do that." Damien studied her for only a moment before nodding once. "Coordinate with the palace physician and Clara from the Omega Quarter," he said. "Whatever resources you need, you will have them." The following hours blurred into a controlled storm of activity. Alara organized makeshift treatment areas throughout the palace's lower halls, directing servants to gather bandages, herbs, and clean water, while assigning healers to different levels of injury severity as the wounded began arriving in waves. Villagers with burns from torched homes, soldiers with deep cuts from close combat, children separated from frightened parents in the chaos of evacuation, all moved through the halls she had transformed into an emergency clinic within a matter of hours. Damien rode out with a portion of his forces before dawn to reinforce the border, leaving Alara to manage the growing crisis within the palace walls. She barely stopped moving throughout the following day, her hands steady even as exhaustion pulled at every muscle in her body. Her voice calm even as fear for Damien's safety gnawed quietly beneath her composed exterior. By evening, reports began filtering back from the border. The initial Ashborn assault had been repelled, though not without significant losses on both sides. Alara continued treating the wounded long into the night, refusing rest until every patient in her care had been properly attended. It was well past midnight when she finally allowed herself a moment to sit, exhaustion finally overtaking her in a quiet corner of the makeshift clinic. She had not seen Damien since he rode out that morning, and worry pressed heavily against her chest, despite every attempt to focus instead on the work in front of her. A commotion near the entrance drew her attention, and she rose quickly, relief flooding through her as she recognized Damien's tall figure among the returning soldiers, though his armor was scratched and his movements carried visible fatigue. "You're safe," she said, moving toward him without thinking, relief overriding every careful boundary she had maintained between them since the ceremony. "The border holds for now," Damien said, though his expression remained grim. "But Ashborn will return. This was a testing strike, nothing more. They wanted to measure our response before committing to something larger. Then we prepare for that," Alara said firmly. Damien studied her exhausted face, noting the dried blood on her sleeves, the dark circles beneath her eyes from hours without rest. "You have not stopped working since I left," he said. "Neither have you," she replied. Something passed between them in that moment. An understanding forged not through ceremony or tradition, but through shared exhaustion and mutual purpose, in the face of genuine crisis. Damien reached out, hesitating only briefly before taking her hand gently in his own, his thumb brushing lightly across the mark still glowing faintly on her wrist. "Whatever the fire intended that night," he said quietly, "I no longer question it. I have watched you organize an entire crisis with more skill than generals who trained their whole lives for this. I have watched you treat strangers with the same care you would give family. Whatever doubts I carried before, they have no place remaining now." Alara felt her breath catch at the sincerity in his voice, warmth spreading through her chest despite the exhaustion weighing on every part of her body. "I feared for you today," she admitted quietly, "more than I expected to." "And I thought of you throughout the entire ride to the border," Damien said, "wondering whether you were safe here. wondering whether the crisis would overwhelm even your considerable skill. They stood together in quiet exhaustion, the chaos of the makeshift clinic settling into something calmer around them, as the worst of the emergency finally began to ease. Whatever had begun that chaotic night in the Great Hall, whatever confusion and reluctance had followed in the days since, something steadier had taken root between them now. Tested and proven through crisis neither of them had chosen but both had faced together. 2 days later, as the palace slowly returned to its normal rhythm and the wounded continued their recovery under careful supervision, word arrived that Ashbourne forces had withdrawn entirely from the border, apparently satisfied with whatever information their testing strike had gathered. Damien called a meeting of his generals and elders to discuss the implications, and Alara found herself included without question this time, her place at the table no longer something anyone thought to challenge. They will return with greater numbers, one general warned, likely within the season, once they have finished analyzing our defensive response. Then we prepare accordingly, Damien said, strengthen the border garrisons, increase patrols, and ensure our own house remains united, rather than fractured by internal disputes that weaken us from within. His eyes flicked briefly toward Alara as he spoke the final words, and she understood the deeper meaning behind them immediately. Whatever schemes Elena and her family continued weaving in the shadows of the palace, they could no longer afford the luxury of internal conflict, while an external threat loomed on the horizon. The kingdom needed unity now more than ever, and Alara found herself determined to help provide it, whatever cost that determination might eventually demand. A hooded figure slipped through the servant passage behind the palace stables just before midnight, moving quickly past sleeping guards toward the outer gate, and it was pure chance that a young stable hand noticed the unfamiliar shape and quietly alerted the night watch. By the time Alara heard the news the following morning, the figure had already been captured attempting to leave the palace grounds with a satchel of documents that did not belong to them. Damien summoned her immediately to the same council chamber where they had first discussed the fire's tampering weeks earlier, his expression grim with barely restrained anger. "Explain what was found," he said to the captain of the guard standing at attention near the door. "The intruder was a messenger employed by Lady Frost's household," the captain reported. The satchel contained letters detailing correspondence between Lady Frost and a contact within the Ashbourne court, discussing troop movements along our northern border and weaknesses in our current defensive positions. The room fell into stunned silence. Alara felt her stomach twist with disbelief. "She was sharing our defenses with the enemy," she said slowly. "It appears so," the captain confirmed. "The letters suggest this correspondence began shortly after the selection ceremony, around the same time the tampering with the ceremonial fire was discovered." Damien's jaw tightened to something carved from stone. "Bring Lady Frost and Elena Frost before this council immediately," he said. "I want answers, and I want them today." Elena arrived within the hour, her composure notably absent for the first time since Alara had known her, her hands trembling slightly as guards escorted her into the chamber. Lady Frost followed close behind, her expression carefully controlled, though a flicker of genuine fear crossed her features when she saw the satchel of letters resting on the council table. "Explain this," Damien said, gesturing toward the documents without preamble. "I do not know what those letters contain," Lady Frost said, though her voice lacked conviction. "They contain details of our northern defenses," Damien said coldly, "shared with contacts inside the Ashbourne court, timed suspiciously close to the ceremony you tampered with using clear flame root." He leaned forward slightly. "Would you care to explain that as well, or shall I ask Edmund to repeat his testimony in front of the full council?" Lady Frost's face drained of color entirely. Beside her, Elena turned sharply toward her mother, genuine shock replacing the calculated composure she had maintained throughout every previous confrontation. "Mother," Elena said, her voice unsteady. "What is he talking about?" "I did what was necessary," Lady Frost said, desperation creeping into her tone as she realized the depth of what had been uncovered. "The ceremony was meant to secure your future, Elena. When it went wrong, I needed leverage, something to force a reconsideration of the outcome. Ashbourne offered support in exchange for information, support that could have pressured the elders into recognizing the ceremony as invalid. You conspired with our enemies to undo my own bond," Elena said, horror creeping into her expression as the full weight of her mother's betrayal became clear. "You risked the safety of our entire kingdom to secure a position I never even asked you to guarantee through such means." "Everything I did was for your future," Lady Frost insisted, though the words rang hollow even to Alara's ears. "You nearly cost our people their lives," Elena said, her voice rising with anger, that seemed, for the first time, directed entirely at her own family, rather than at Alara. Villages were attacked. People died defending our borders, while you shared information that made that attack possible. Damien turned to the guards standing near the chamber door. Take Lady Frost into custody, he said. She will face full judgment for treason against this kingdom. As guards moved to escort her away, Lady Frost's composure finally shattered entirely, pleading and protesting as she was led from the chamber, her earlier calculated confidence replaced by desperate fear of the consequences awaiting her. Elena remained standing where she was, visibly shaken, staring at the space where her mother had been, as though trying to reconcile the woman who raised her with the traitor just exposed before the entire council. Elena Frost, Damien said, his voice softening slightly as he addressed her directly. Were you aware of your mother's actions? No, Elena said quietly, her voice barely audible. I swear to you, I knew nothing of this. I was angry about the ceremony, yes. I believed I deserved the bond that was promised to me since childhood. But I never wished harm upon our people, and I never conspired with Ashbourne against our own kingdom. Elara studied Elena carefully, searching for any sign of deception in her expression, but found only genuine devastation, the look of someone whose entire understanding of her family had just been violently upended. I believe her, Elara said quietly, surprising even herself with the admission. Damien glanced at her, considering the words carefully, before turning back to Elena. Your mother's actions were her own, he said. I will not hold you responsible for crimes you did not commit or condone. However, given the circumstances, I believe it would be best for you to leave the capital for a time, until trust can be properly rebuilt between your family's remaining members and this court. Elena nodded slowly, tears finally slipping free from eyes that had remained fiercely controlled through every previous confrontation. I understand, she said. I have spent weeks resenting a bond I believed was stolen from me unfairly. I did not realize how much worse things could become, while I focused on that resentment instead of the truth right in front of me. She looked toward Elara then, something shifting in her expression, exhaustion replacing the sharp calculation that had defined every previous interaction between them. For what it is worth, Elena said quietly, I no longer believe the fire made a mistake that night. I think, perhaps, it simply saw something none of us were prepared to accept. I am sorry for everything your family has lost, Elara said, and she meant it genuinely, despite everything Elena had put her through in the weeks since the ceremony. Elena left the chamber shortly after, escorted by guards toward quarters where she would remain until arrangements for her departure from the capital could be finalized. The council chamber settled into heavy silence following her exit, the weight of Lady Frost's betrayal still hanging over everyone present. This changes things considerably, one of the elders said finally. With Lady Frost's treason exposed, the noble houses who supported her cause against your bond will have no foundation left to stand upon. Then perhaps, Damien said, glancing toward Elara with an expression that had grown steadily warmer over the preceding weeks. It is finally time to address this bond properly, without the shadow of scandal and scheming hanging over every step we take together. Elara felt her heart quicken at the implication behind his words, understanding that whatever remained of the doubt and reluctance that had defined their earliest days together, it had finally been cleared away entirely by truth, courage, and the quiet trust that had grown steadily between them through every crisis they had faced side by side. Bells rang across the capital before sunrise, calling every pack member toward the Great Hall for the second time since the night that had upended Elara's entire life, and this time, she walked toward that fire without a single trace of the fear that had gripped her the first time she crossed its threshold. Word of Lady Frost's treason had spread quickly through the kingdom in the days following her arrest, and with it, the last remnants of doubt surrounding Elara's place, as Luna had finally begun to dissolve. Nobles who once whispered behind gloved hands now greeted her with genuine respect, remembering how she had organized emergency care for hundreds of wounded during the Ashbourne strike, how she had treated a dangerous fever outbreak in the Omega Quarter, with skill few trained physicians could match. Elara stood now in a chamber near the Great Hall, dressed not in the borrowed silk Margaret had first presented to her weeks earlier, but in a gown chosen specifically for this day, deep blue fabric embroidered with silver thread that caught the morning light streaming through tall windows. Margaret herself stood beside her, adjusting the final details of her appearance with hands that had grown noticeably gentler since those first uncertain days. You have come a long way since that first night, Margaret said, securing a final pin in Elara's carefully arranged hair. I confess, I doubted whether a healer from the back of the hall could ever truly hold this position. I am glad to admit I was wrong. Thank you, Margaret, Elara said, meaning the words more deeply than simple courtesy required, for everything you have taught me these past weeks. A knock sounded at the door, and Nathaniel entered. the old historian carrying a small leather volume against his chest, his expression carrying quiet satisfaction. "I thought you might wish to see this before the ceremony begins," he said, opening the book to a page he had clearly marked in advance. Ilara looked down to find a new entry, freshly written in Nathaniel's careful hand, describing the events of the past weeks in careful, measured language, ending with a note that echoed the very history he had shared with her in the archive. "The fire has once again proven itself beyond the influence of expectation or scheme, choosing truth even when concealed beneath tampering and deception, revealing a bond that has since proven itself through crisis, courage, and quiet devotion neither party initially sought, but both have come to embrace fully." "You believe this is worthy of the historical record?" Ilara asked, touched by the gesture. "I believe," Nathaniel said, closing the book gently, "that future generations should understand exactly what happened here, so that the fear surrounding the fire's judgment might finally begin to ease. Perhaps, in time, fewer families will attempt what Lady Frost attempted, once they understand the fire cannot be fooled, only delayed." Ilara thanked him warmly before he departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts for a few final quiet moments before the ceremony began. She thought of everything that had happened since that chaotic night when Damien's voice had broken over her name instead of Elena's, the confusion and fear that had followed, the slow, uncertain trust that had built steadily between them through fever outbreaks and border conflicts and buried family secrets finally brought into the light. A gentle knock came again, and this time Damien himself stood in the doorway, dressed in formal black and silver, his expression carrying none of the guarded distance that had once defined every interaction between them. He crossed the room and took her hands gently in his own, his thumb brushing softly across the mark still glowing steady and warm on her wrist. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "I believe I have been ready for longer than I realized," Ilara said, and found she meant every word completely. They walked together toward the great hall, where the entire kingdom had gathered once more before the same ancient fire that had first bound them together through chaos and confusion. This time, however, no tension hung in the air, no whispered scandal or uncertain glances followed their path through the crowd. Instead, pack members bowed respectfully as they passed, murmurs of genuine welcome replacing the earlier suspicion that had once surrounded Ilara's unexpected rise to the position beside their king. The eldest elder stood waiting near the fire, his expression solemn with ceremonial gravity, as Damien and Ilara took their positions before the flames. "Tonight," the elder announced to the assembled crowd, "we gather not to question the fire's judgment, but to honor it fully, as our king and his true Luna reaffirmed the bond the fire chose freely, without deception or tampering, weeks ago." Damien turned to face Ilara directly, taking both her hands in his own before the entire kingdom. "Ilara Finch," he said, his voice steady and clear enough to carry across the silent hall. "When the fire spoke your name instead of the one I expected, I believed a mistake had occurred, one that threatened to unravel everything I thought I understood about duty and destiny alike. I know now that no mistake occurred that night. The fire saw what I could not yet recognize in myself, a truth buried beneath years of comfortable assumption. I choose you now, not because the fire demands it, but because I have come to understand exactly why it chose you in the first place." Ilara felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes, though she blinked them back, meeting his gaze steadily as she spoke her own response. "Damien Voss," she said, "I never sought this bond, never imagined myself standing before an entire kingdom as anything more than the healer working quietly in the back of the hall. But I have come to understand, through every crisis we have faced together, through every truth we have uncovered side by side, that the fire did not simply choose a Luna for this kingdom. It chose a partner capable of standing beside you through whatever challenges still lie ahead. I choose you as well, freely and completely." The fire behind them surged suddenly bright and warm, not with the violent confusion of that first chaotic night, but with something steadier, more settled, as though acknowledging a truth finally spoken aloud with full understanding, rather than shock and uncertainty. The marks on both their wrists glowed brilliant gold for a long moment before settling into a soft, permanent warmth, sealing a bond that had already proven itself through every test the weeks since the ceremony had demanded of them. The kingdom erupted into celebration, cheers and applause echoing through the great hall, as pack members who had once doubted the fire's judgment now embraced its wisdom fully. Ilara looked out across the joyful crowd, remembering the frightened girl who had stood near the back wall of this very hall weeks earlier, uncertain and afraid of a destiny she had never asked for, and felt profound gratitude for everything that journey had taught her. Damien squeezed her hands gently, drawing her attention back to him, his expression carrying a warmth she suspected would only continue growing in the years ahead. "Whatever challenges Ashbourne or any other threat may bring to our door," he said quietly, meant only for her amid the surrounding celebration, "I find myself grateful, more than I ever expected to be, for a fire that refused to make the mistake everyone believed it had made." "As am I," Elara said softly, allowing herself finally, completely, to embrace the life the fire had chosen for her, standing not as an overlooked healer from the back of a crowded hall, but as the true and rightful Luna of a kingdom that had finally learned to recognize the difference between comfortable expectation and undeniable truth. The celebration continued long into the night, laughter and music replacing the tense whispers that had once filled these halls. And as Elara looked out over the joyful crowd beside the man fate had chosen for her through fire and truth alike, she understood with complete certainty that whatever name had first echoed through this hall by accident, the life it had led her toward was no mistake at all.